So you know some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you want to put it all together so that you can create rich and reactive user experiences. But you're missing one key component, the glue, if you will, that pulls it all together. We call that the Document Object Model, or simply DOM, and it gives us the ability to manipulate our page's content with JavaScript. I am Jeremy McPeak with Envato Tuts Plus, and I invite you to join me so that I can teach you everything that you need to know to manipulate the DOM. Over the next several lessons, you will learn what the DOM is and how it is structured so that you can find the elements that you want to work with, add and remove elements to your page on the fly, modify an element style, and handle events so that you can react to your users' actions. By the end of the course, you will know what you need to effectively manipulate the DOM. But before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the Envato Tuts Plus channel. We have a lot of fantastic content, and I don't want you to miss out on any of it. Now, let's get started. You obviously know that a web page is just HTML at its most basic level, and the browser is going to load that HTML, and it's going to render it so that our users can view the content that we want them to see. But behind the scenes, the browser does a lot more than that. It loads our HTML into a set of JavaScript objects that we can access, and we can make changes to our web page. These objects are called the Document Object Model, or simply the DOM. And we use JavaScript to access and make changes to the DOM. Like, for example, I have a button here that says Toggle Style. When I click it, it changes the style of the page. If I click it again, it goes back to its original state. Now, this change isn't permanent. I'm not changing the HTML file here. Whenever I refresh the page, it's going to load from scratch, and any change I made is gone. But the DOM gives us access to everything within our HTML so that we can make whatever change that we want so that we can build expressive and rich user experiences. So the browser is going to build this DOM for us, and it's going to be closely structured to how our HTML is structured. Like, for example, there's going to be just an all-encompassing document object, which represents the entire document. But then there's going to be a property called document element, which represents the HTML element. There will be one called head that represents the head, and then one that represents the body. But then we can also access the individual elements, or if we wanted to manipulate or make changes to the attributes or even the text of those elements, we have that ability. So let's go back to the browser. Let's pull up the developer tools, that is the F12 key. And let's first of all look at the Elements tab. Now, the developer tools are going to be basically the same regardless of what browser you're using, primarily because the majority of modern browsers use Chrome as their basis. And so, well, it's going to look like this. If you're using Firefox, the same tools are going to be there. It's just going to look a little bit different. But this first tab is called Elements, and it looks like the source code for our HTML, but it isn't. This is a representation of the HTML as it is currently loaded within the browser. And also notice that as I hover my mouse over these individual elements, we can see that they are highlighted in the rendered page, which is a nice little feature. But one thing I want you to focus on is this body element right here. Notice that there is no class attributes or anything like that. Whenever I click on Toggle Style, the body element changes. We now have this class attribute, and it is set to dark. Now, this, of course, is not in our HTML. The body tag has no class attribute whatsoever. So what you see inside of the Elements tab is a representation of the HTML as it is currently rendered in the document. So with the body tag selected, let's go to this other panel and let's find the properties. So remember I said that the DOM is just a set of JavaScript objects. So everything inside of the DOM is an object, which basically means that those objects are going to have properties. And we can see here that with the body selected, these are all of the properties that we have access to. And there are a lot of them. But one thing I want you to notice is that the term node is being used in quite a few places. Like, for example, here we have child nodes. If we scroll down a little bit more, we'll have node name and node type. You will see the term node being used throughout the DOM because everything in the DOM is considered to be a node. An element is a node. Even just plain text is a node, and attributes are nodes. And with that in mind, I want to hop on over to the console here, because this is going to give us the ability to access the DOM by just typing stuff into the console. So by typing document, this is the topmost object that we can use to access and work with the document. You can see that the browser is highlighting, well, it did. The browser highlights the entire document because the document is what is currently loaded into the browser. If we wanted to access the HTML elements, we would use the document element property on the document object. You can see here that it is still going to highlight that, but it's a little bit different than the document. And then we can access the head. So that is the document.head property. Since the head really isn't rendered, then we don't see that being highlighted. But if we take a look at the body, we can see that that gives us access to the body. But let's say that we wanted to get access to this H1 element. Now, if we take a look at the H1 element, that is the first element inside of the body. And since it is inside of the body, we could essentially say that the H1 element is a child of the body element. So there is this concept of children and parents. So if we take a look at the body and we just type child, we will see a lot of properties that are listed with child nodes, children, last child, first child, and all of these other childs. What I am interested in here is this child nodes. Now, once again, this idea of everything being a node. So child nodes are all of the nodes that are children of the body. And remember, I said that even text can be a node. And here we see text as the first child in the body. Well, that's kind of weird, because if we take a look at the HTML, there is no text, but actually there is. It's white space. It is a carriage return followed by some white space. So it's in between the opening body tag and the H1 element. That little bit of text is being loaded in the DOM as a text node. And all of these other text nodes are just white space, because as you'll notice as I hover my mouse over these individual nodes, some of them are being highlighted in the browser. And those are primarily these elements, the H1 element, the P element, the div element, and the other div element, but none of the text, because white space is essentially ignored whenever the browser is rendering our HTML. But just because we can't see it doesn't mean that it is not there. So if we wanted to access this H1 element, we could do that using document.body. We could use the child nodes. Now, this is a node list, which works kind of like an array, but it is not an array. And since we know that H1 element is the second child inside of the body, we would use the index of 1. And that gives us that H1 element. Now, one thing that I know can be very confusing is the idea of using JavaScript to work with the DOM. The DOM itself is not JavaScript. They are JavaScript objects, but they are not actually part of the JavaScript language. So document is not in the JavaScript language, but it is part of the DOM. And it therefore has a set of properties and methods that we can use JavaScript to access and make changes to. Body is part of the DOM. It's not part of the JavaScript language, but we are using JavaScript to program these objects. You can really think of the browser as an operating system. We write a program using JavaScript that is going to run inside of the browser. Now, we can access this H1 element in another way. There is a first child property, which, as we know, is the text between the body tag and the H1 element. But by accessing that first child, we can then move to the h1 element with the next sibling property. So we can essentially do what's called walking the DOM. We can walk from one object to another object so that we can access yet another object, which would then give us the ability to walk to another object. It's very tedious, very time consuming, and really we don't do that anymore. Instead, we have a set of methods that we can use to get or search for certain elements, which we will look at next. You now know that the browser loads our HTML into a set of JavaScript objects that we call the DOM. And we use JavaScript to access the DOM, and we can make changes. All we need to do is access the objects that we want to work with. Like, for example, if we wanted to work with this h1 element, well, we could get there by walking the DOM, document.body, and then we can get the first child, which is the text in between the body tag and the h1 element, and then we can move to the next sibling, and that'll get us there, but nobody wants to type that. So thankfully, the document gives us several methods that we can use to easily get or search for elements. The first method is probably the most straightforward. It's probably the most used method, and it is called getElementById. And its name basically tells you what it does. It is going to get an element based upon that element's ID. So here the h1 element just happens to have an ID value. And the ID value is supposed to be unique throughout the entire document. So this h1 element has an ID of intro text. There should not be any other element inside of this same document that has that same ID. This is supposed to be unique. So we can use this ID to get the h1 element. All we have to do is pass in the ID of the element that we want to retrieve, and voila, we have our h1 element. So let's go back to our HTML. Let's add a script element. And let's first of all create a variable, h1 element, because usually whenever you want to retrieve an element so that you can work with it, you want to store it in a variable so that you can easily access it. Because you don't want to call getElementById for the same element multiple times, because even though it's very fast, there is some overhead involved because the browser still has to reach into the DOM and find that element. So we want the intro text ID that gives us the h1 element. And let's say that we wanted to change its text. So now that we have this variable, this is a global variable, and we will have access to it inside of the console here in the browser. So let's say that we wanted to change the text. So if we take a look at the child nodes, we can see that the node list just has a single child, and it is that text of the h1 element. We want to change that. And if we drill down even more, we can see that there is the node value property. Now, I'm pointing all of this out because the console is a fantastic tool. This gives us the ability to inspect objects, to look at what is currently loaded in the browser and what is loaded in memory so that we can get an idea of what is available to us. So here we can see that by using this h1 variable that we've created, we can use the child nodes on that h1 element so that we can see all of the child nodes and see their values. So we want to change this node value. So we can go back to our code here and we can say h1 element, and then we could say child nodes and then use the index of 0, or we can use simply the first child property. Either way, that's going to give us that child node. And then we want to set the node value. And let's set it to something like the get methods, because we have 3 methods that we will use to get elements. So by making this change, we can go back to the browser, we can refresh, and we can see that the text for our h1 element changes, the get methods. Now, of course, we're making this change through JavaScript. We haven't made any other change to the HTML. So all we have to do is comment out this line of code if we don't want to change that h1 value, and voila, we're back to where we were. But That's not what we want to do. We want to change some of this. And let's take this a step further. Let's also give it a different color. Now, when it comes to changing style, which we will talk about later, we can do so in two ways. We can change the CSS classes that are applied to that element, or we can modify what is essentially the style attribute. Because in HTML, we can use a style attribute, and then we could set the CSS properties that we want to set. Well, we can do the same thing with JavaScript. There is this style property that maps directly to the style attribute. So all we have to do is set the CSS property color in this particular case, and we want to give it the value of yellow. So if we go back to the browser, this isn't going to be very visible. So let's do this. Let's go to our body. Let's set the class of dark so that that is going to be default. And now we will see that the text of our H1 element is not only changed, but it is also yellow. Well, let's change the color of all of the P elements. Now, yes, of course, we could do this through CSS, but where's the fun in that? Let's do it through JavaScript. So we want to find all of the P elements within the document so that we can change their style as well. Well, the document object gives us a method called getElementsByTagName. So basically all we need to do is supply the tag name of the elements that we want to get. In this case, it is simply P, and then that will give us what's called an HTML collection. Now, the child nodes gave us a node list. This is called HTML collection, which is, well, it's different than a node list. An HTML collection isn't as smart as a node list. And we're just going to leave it at that. But this is also an array-like structure so that we can use the for of loop to iterate over these elements, and then we can change their style. And we will do that once again by using this style property. Let's set the color, and let's change this to violet. That should be different enough so that whenever we view this in the browser, the text changes for our P elements. Well, that's great. But what if we had elements that had a certain CSS class that we wanted to retrieve? So let's add a class to this first div element. And we'll just set this to, let's just say custom BG. And we will give this a custom background. So the document object gives us a method called getElementsByClassName. And it kind of works like document getElementById in that we pass in the CSS class that we want to search for. So in this case, we want the custom-bg class that is going to give us a collection of those elements, and then we can iterate over them using the for of loop. And in this particular case, let's change the background color. And we will do that using the style property once again. But if you think of the CSS property of background color, it is background-color. Well, that's not a valid JavaScript variable name. So instead, whenever you are working with CSS property names in JavaScript and it has a dash, you simply remove the dash and then camel case it. So background-color becomes background color where the C is uppercase. And in this case, we are going to set the color to dim gray. That's still going to be dark, but it's not going to be as dark as black. So if we go back to the browser, we can refresh. And there we can see that the background for that first div element is now that gray color. The P elements are still violet. And then the H1 element has different text, and it is yellow. Now, that's great and all, but these methods are very basic. We are getting an element by its ID, by its tag name, or by its class name. These methods don't give us the ability to perform any more complex searches, such as retrieving only P elements that are inside of div elements. But the document object does give us two methods we can use to perform more complex queries, which we will look at next. The getElementById, getElementsByTagName, and getElementsByClassName methods are very useful. They allow us to get elements based upon those very specific criteria. but they are also very limiting because the criteria is very specific. And our documents are much more than just IDs, tag names, and class names. Like, for example, what if we wanted to retrieve only the P elements that were contained inside of div elements? Now, we could kind of do that with using get elements by tag name, but for each individual P element that we work with, we would have to essentially walk the DOM. We would have to check the parent node of that P element and see if its tag name was a div. And really, that's not even enough, because remember, the idea is to get the P elements that are contained inside of a div element. So we would need to check the parent node of the parent node of the parent node. We would have to walk the DOM, checking the tag name of each parent node to see if this P element was contained inside of a div. And that's just a lot of work that, frankly, I don't want to do, and I know that you don't want to do it either. So thankfully, we have the ability to query the document using CSS selectors, and we can find elements based upon those selectors. Like, for example, we want to get all of the P elements that are inside of divs. So we would use a method called query selector all. And then we simply pass in a CSS selector to select those elements. So in this case, we just want the P elements that are contained inside of a div, so that then we could iterate over those elements. And let's say that we want to change the font weight. So we can set the style, font weight, and we'll set that to simply bold. Let's go to the browser, let's refresh, and nothing happens. Let me make sure I saved that file. I did. So there's an error somewhere. Let's pull up the developer tools, and the console tells us reference error element is not defined. That is correct, because in the loop, I have let elements. That needs to be let element. So that should fix that. Let's refresh. And there we go. We can see that those two P elements, they are contained inside of divs. We can see that those are now bolded. The one P element that is not inside of a div is not bolded. So great, perfect. That was an easy way of solving that particular problem. But let's say this. Let's say that we wanted to retrieve this P element right here. And this one is inside of a div element as well, but we just want that one. And let's say that we will set it as underlined. So let's call this variable special P, and we're going to use a different method. It's called query selector. So we have query selector, which is going to return a single element. Then we have query selector all, which is going to return multiple elements that match the CSS selector. So in this case, we want the P element that is a direct child of div. And then we will set the style text decoration to underline. So let's go to the browser. Let's see what this looks like. And we see that we have a P element underlined, but that is not the P element that we wanted, because that is the P element that is a direct child of the div with a class of custom BG. That is not this other div element. So the reason why this P element was selected was because that was the first element that matched our CSS selector. So whenever you use the query selector method, it will return a single element object. The first one that matches the selector is going to be returned, and that is what you are going to work with. So if you want a specific element, your selector has to be pretty specific, which in our case, we can easily do by using the not pseudo class. And we want the P that is a direct child of div that is not the P that is a direct child of the div with a class of custom BG, and that should work. So if we go back to the browser, we will then see that this other div is now underlined, and that is the div element that we wanted to underline to begin with. So query selector returns a single element. It returns the first element that matches the selector. Query selector all returns all of the elements that match the selector. So now you might be thinking, Why would we use the get methods if the query selector methods gives us a more expressive way of finding the elements that we need? Well, that's a very good question. And in most cases, I would recommend using the query selector methods because they do offer much more flexibility. The exception, however, is get element by ID. So yes, we could change this so that we use query selector and then we could use the ID CSS selector to select that element. And whenever we refresh, we'll see the same result. Of course, the text changed because I changed the text, but we still see that that H1 element is colored yellow. But if you are going to select an element based upon its ID, it is faster to use get element by ID than it is to use query selector, because there is a little bit of overhead involved when you use query selector. So if you want to select an element based upon the ID and only the ID, I recommend using get element by ID. Otherwise, use query selector or query selector all. One of the more powerful things that we can do with JavaScript and the DOM is create content on the fly. So we can create elements, we can give those elements content, we can add attributes, we can change their style, and then we can add those elements to the page. Now, the reason why you might want to do this is you might be working with a web API or some other dynamic content that isn't automatically loaded within the page, but you might want to add it to the page at a later time. In this lesson, we are going to essentially get rid of everything except this H1 element. And in fact, let's change the text here so that it is simply manipulating the DOM. And we are going to add an ordered list that is going to list all of the topics that we have talked about thus far. So not only are we going to create the OL elements, but we will create the individual LI elements. So the first one will be intro to DOM. The second one will be getting elements. And then the third one will be querying the DOM. And then finally creating elements. So that's the goal. We just need to write the code that is going to do that. And to create an element, the first thing we have to do is reference the document object, because just like using the get methods or the query methods, we have to reference the document object. It is the gateway to the document itself. And we're going to call a method called create element. We pass in a string that is the tag name of the element that we want to create. So in this case, it is an OL element for an ordered list. Now, just by creating this element, it is not going to be inside of the document. We have to add it to the document. And that makes perfect sense because we want to be able to add this element wherever we need to. And we can do this in several different ways. The first, and probably the most straightforward, is to just simply add it to the end of the document. Or rather, we would add it to the end of the body. So every node has a method called append child, and then we would pass in the OL element to that method. And if we take a look at this in the browser, we are going to see the OL element at the end of the body. So here's the body, the H1 element, the script element, and the OL element. Now, in this particular case, it really doesn't matter what order those elements are. As long as the H1 element is first, I'm happy with that because what matters is how it is rendered in the browser, at least in my opinion. However, we might want to place the OL element before the script element, and we can do that in several different ways. The first would be to get the script element object so that we can reference that, and then we can say that I want to insert this OL element before the script element. So let's look at what that would look like. So let's first of all retrieve our script element. We can use query selector here, and we just want to select the script element. And once we have that, then we would use document body, but then we would call a method insert before. The idea being that we want to insert the OL element before whatever element we specify. So in this case, it is going to be the script element. So if we take a look at this in the browser, we will see now we have h1 is first, followed by OL, and then the script element. So that's one way of doing it. The other way would be to use the h1 element as our reference point. And every element object has a method called insert adjacent element. And we pass two arguments here. The first is a string that is going to specify where we want to insert the element that we pass as the second argument. So there are 4 values here. The first is called before begin, which is essentially going to insert our element before the h1 element, because we are inserting this before the h1 element begins. We can see that by refreshing. The OL element is now before the h1 element. So we have before begin, we have after begin, which is going to insert the OL element after the opening h1 tag. So let's refresh. If we drill down into the h1 element, we see that the OL element comes before the text of manipulating the DOM. The third option is called before end, which, as you might guess by now, this is going to place the OL element before the ending tag of the h1 element. So now we have h1, we have our text, we have OL, then we have the closing tag. But in our case, I want to use the fourth option, which is after end, which is going to insert the OL element after the closing tag. So now we have our h1 element, followed by the OL element, and then the script element. So as you can see, the DOM gives us different ways of essentially doing the same thing, which is really a good sign of a well thought out API, because no matter what node we have as a reference, we should be able to insert another node wherever we need to. Okay, so now that we have this OL element, we need to create the LI elements. And we are going to do so using the quote-unquote correct way, which means that we are going to create an element, and then we are also going to create a text node to contain our text. And then I will show you an easier way of doing that. So we have 4 LI elements that we need to create. So I'm going to call this first one LI1, and we will create the LI element for that. But we also need some content for this. So let's create a variable called text, and we are going to create a text node. And then we pass in the text for this node, which in this particular case is going to be intro to DOM. So that now we want to add that text to the LI element. So I'm going to use the append child. We'll pass in text, and then we will append this LI element to the OL element, just like that. So if we take a look at the browser, we are going to see nothing, because we have an error that the OL, I got a little lazy here, and that is OL element. So if we go back, refresh, there we see our intro to DOM. All right, we just have to do that a few more times. Let's call this text1 so that we can have individual text nodes. And so now we will create the second LI element, and then we will create the text node for that. I'm just going to copy and paste. We will make the necessary changes. And this one was getting elements, so that we can append the text2 to the li2, so that we can append li2 after li1. So let's test that out. And we lost some text, probably because I did something wrong, and it's right here. I overwrote some code. I'm not going to fix this because this is a very tedious thing to do. We would have to create more elements, more text, and all of that. So instead, I think a better option would be to do something like this, so that we can have an array of strings, and we can just call this array topics. And then we would have intro to DOM, followed by the getting elements topic. Then we would have the querying the DOM topic. And then finally, the topic of this lesson, creating elements. So we will use this array, and we will iterate over the array to create our elements and then add them to the document. So let's get rid of all this other code that we just created. And while there are so many different ways that we can iterate over our topics, let's just use the for each method. And for the callback function, we will work with the text so that inside of this callback function, we will create our li element using the create element method. Then we will set the text. Now we could create text nodes here, but let's just be lazy. Let's use a property called inner HTML. Now, there used to be some controversy using the inner HTML property. First of all, because it wasn't standard. It was created by Microsoft. But the more important thing was that it could mess up the structure of the document. But that's not the case anymore. This is perfectly fine to do. And as its name implies, we can use HTML here. So if we wanted this li element to have bolded text, we could do something like this, to where we would wrap our text with a B element. And that would be fine, so that then we would append this li element to our ol element, and that would give us our list. So if we take a look at this in the browser, we are now going to have our list of topics, and we can see that the text is bolded. But let's just use simple text here. We don't need to use any HTML, so that now we have just plain ordinary text. Now, there's one other thing that I want to point out to you, and that is the order in which I did all of this. I created an OL element. I then created the LI elements and appended them to the OL element. And then finally, I added that OL element to the page. And the reason why I point this out is because anytime you make a change to the document, the browser has to re-render the page. So if I created the list and then immediately appended that list to the document, that in and of itself would be okay. But then I created list items and appended those list items to the page. So every time I add an li element, it would cause the browser to re-render the page. Now our page is very simple, but imagine you have a full-fledged web application, a very rich UI. And if you make a lot of changes to the UI, then the browser is going to have to re-render in order to keep up with those changes. So the less change that you can make to the document, the better, which is why I created the list, I populated the list, and then I added the list at the end of this whole process. So just keep that in mind. Now, many modern UI frameworks handle that very gracefully, so you don't have to think about that. But if you are writing vanilla JavaScript or using some kind of helper library like jQuery or something like that, then it is something that you will need to be aware of and plan accordingly. If we can create and add elements to the document, then it kind of goes without saying that we can remove elements from the document. And so in this lesson, we will look at removing elements. And then in the next lesson, we will look at modifying element classes. So there we go. Now, of course, we don't really care about modifying element classes right now because we are currently talking about removing elements. So we don't really need this item, this modifying element classes in the list. So, we could fix that by just commenting it out, or we could just remove that li element from our list. Let's do that. That's a little bit more fun. So there are two ways that we can remove an element. The first involves the parent element. So we want to remove this li element. That means that we need to use its parent, which is the ordered list element. So we would use the ol element, and we have a method called simply remove child. And then we just specify the child that we want to remove. Well, in our case, it's very easy because the element that we want to move is the last li element that is in the list. So we can use our ol element once again, and we have a property called last child that gets the last child node within ol element. So if we go to the browser and refresh, we see that that item is now gone. That's perfect. And one of the really cool things about remove child is that it removes the child, but it also returns that child. So we could create a variable called last.li, and this gives us the ability to really do whatever we need to with this element. Now, if we don't need to do anything, then great, it's gone. It is no longer in the document. But if we need to make a lot of changes to it, then we could definitely do that here. Or if we needed to move it to another list. In fact, that would be a little fun. Let's do that. So after our script element, let's add a UL element. So we want to append it here to the UL element, which means that we need to retrieve that. So let's call the variable UL element. We will use query selector, and we will select the UL element so that after we remove that item from the ordered list, we will add it to the unordered list, and we will just use append child. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you that this is not going to work. In fact, we are going to get an error. Let's refresh. Our list is gone. So let's go to the console, and we see that it cannot read properties of null, and it's attempting to read append child. And the error is occurring on line 48. So basically, it's trying to read append child on a null object. So let's go to line 48, which is the last line of code that we executed. So it is trying to read append child on UL element, but UL element is currently null. So here is one very important thing that you will need to remember, and that is you cannot retrieve or work with elements that are not in the document. I mean, that sounds very obvious, but it is something that is very, very common. Now, I can hear you saying, but it is in the document. It's defined right here after our script. And yes, it is. But here's the thing. Our JavaScript is executing before the browser has loaded that UL element. As far as JavaScript is concerned, and really as far as the DOM is concerned, this UL element doesn't exist because it has not been loaded into the DOM. Our JavaScript is executing before that happens. So a lot of times you would want to place your code at the very bottom of the body. This gives the browser the opportunity to load all of the HTML before your code executes. It's just a good habit to get into. So by moving the UL element above our script element, well, that's going to fix that particular problem. So we can go back to the browser, we can refresh, and now we have two lists. We have our ordered list, and then we have our unordered list. That's great. So I said that there are two ways. That is the first. The second way is much more straightforward because we don't have to use the parent. If we already have the element that we want to remove, well, then we can just call the remove method. So this is what we could do. We could get that last child. Let's create the last li element. We will say ol element so that we could get last child. That gives us that element object so that then we can call the remove method. Now, remove doesn't return anything. So if we wanted to continue to work with this last li object, then we need to save it as a variable like I did here. And so after we save it as a variable, we call the remove method that removes it from the document. It hasn't deleted it. It is just simply in memory out of the document so that once again, we can work with it. We can do whatever we need to. And then if we wanted to, we can either add it to the same list or we could add it to our unordered list so that we can go back to the browser, let's refresh, and we see the same result. So 3 things to take away from this particular lesson. First, define all of your JavaScript at the bottom of the document. That gives the browser the opportunity to load everything else so that your code can work with whatever elements that it needs to. Second, if you want to remove an element, there are 2 ways. The first has you use the parent element to remove the child that you want to remove. The second is to just simply call the remove method on the element that you want to remove. There is no right or wrong way to do it. Just use whichever way makes sense to you. One of the most common things that you will do is change an element's style. And we have briefly talked about that with the style property. That, of course, maps directly to the style attribute on the element, and then you just simply set whatever CSS property that you need. The issue is that if you need to change multiple CSS properties, well, then you have to write multiple lines of code. So here I'm changing the color and then the background color, and that requires 2 lines of code. And it's not just more work for you, it's also more work for the browser, because let's assume that this li element is already rendered in the page. The browser would have to redraw the element with the color red. It would then have to redraw the element with a background color of blue. And then, of course, for every other property that you change, it would need to redraw that element. So there are times when it makes sense to use the style property. There aren't any hard and fast rules for that. It just comes down to, does it make sense for you? Because more often than not, we manipulate style by changing the CSS classes that are applied to an element. That's just what we typically do in modern development. But let's first clean up this code a little bit. We don't need our UL element. We don't need the code that references UL elements. We don't need our script element, or at least the code that references that element. And let's get rid of practically everything that isn't involved with creating our list and adding that list to the document. So that's nice and clean. Let's go ahead and let's add all of the topics that we will discuss, such as working with attributes. That is what we will talk about next. Then DOM event basics, and then finally common DOM events. So if we take a look in the browser, we should see our list, and that's great. But what I want to do is color code these so that the topics that we have talked about will be one color, the current topic will be another color, and then finally the topics we have yet to discuss will be yet another color. Okay, so manipulating the class attribute can be done in 2 ways. The first way is to use a property called class name. So our body has a class of dark. We can work with that class attribute with the class name property. And whatever value we set to the class name property is going to be set as the value for the class attribute. So by setting class name as an empty string, it is going to remove that dark class from the body. And now we have that searing light into our eyes. So let's change that back. But let's say that we want to keep the dark class, but we want to add another class, like something else. But once again, this isn't adding something else. This is removing the dark class and replacing it with something else. And we can see that being done right there in the browser. So what we need to do is get the current value of the class name, and we can store that in a variable that I'll just call class name. And then we will concatenate that with whatever CSS class that we want to add. So then we would set the class name property equal to what is in our class name variable, and then our something else class. So that now our dark theme is applied and the something else class is there. So this is the first way. This is also the oldest way, and we typically don't use class name at all anymore because we now have a property that makes it so much easier to work with the classes that are applied to an element, because this can get not confusing, but we can make a lot of mistakes by just using the class name property. So instead, what we do is use a property called class list. This gives us a set of methods that we can use to add classes, to remove classes, to replace a class with another class, or to toggle a class. Let's start with toggle because that's probably the easiest. If the class that we want to toggle is currently applied to the element, then it will remove that class. So we are going to toggle the dark class, which is actually going to remove it because the body element already had the dark class. But if we toggle that again, It's just going to add it back. So that wasn't that useful. However, I do want to get rid of the dark class because I want to use Bootstrap's dark theme. So I'm going to call the remove method, and we're going to remove the dark class from our body. I'm going to do this at the very top of our code so that it is the first thing that we do. And in order to turn on Bootstrap's dark theme, we have to go to the HTML element and add in the databs theme attribute, set that to dark, and now we have a much better dark theme. So we are going to color code our topics. So let's start with the color that is going to represent the topics that we have discussed. So for our li elements, we will use the class list property, and we will add text info. This is a class from Bootstrap, and it will give us a teal color. But of course, that's coloring everything, and we don't need to do that. So in order to know what color to use for which topic, we need to keep track of the index that we are working with. So thankfully, we can easily get the index by specifying the second parameter to our callback function for the for each method. It will give us the index to work with. We also need to know what the current topic index is, which I think is 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, that is correct. So now we can do something like this. If the index is less than the current topic index, then we will set the class list so that we add the text info class. Else if index is greater than current topic index, we want to add a different class. This will be text danger. And then finally, we have the current topic, in which case we will set the class list to add the text warning class. So with that, we can go back to the browser and voila, we have our color-coded topics. And that's nice, but I want to add a little bit more style to the current topic. Not only do I want it to be its own color, but let's make it underlined. Let's also make it bold. And we can do that by defining a class that has those properties. So let's just call the class current topic, and we will set the text underline property, or not text underline, it's text decoration to underline. And then we will set font weight to simply bold. Now to add another class, all we have to do is pass the class name to the add method. So you can pass as many classes as you want to the add method, and it will add those classes. So now whenever we go to the browser, we should see our current topic underlined, bold, and its own color. So that's great. Now, if you can add multiple classes, it goes without saying that you can remove multiple classes as well. All you have to do is pass in the classes that you want to remove as separate arguments. So I'm going to add a comment here just so that we can see that that is something that we can do. But after all that, let's say that we want to replace the text warning. So let's do it like this, to where we will call query selector. We want to select the element that has the text warning class so that we can access its class list, and we want to replace the text warning with text success. That will change the color to, I think it's green, but we'll see. Let's refresh, and we have an error. So cannot read properties of null, reading class list. So let's take a look here. Query selector. We want to select the element that has text. Oh, yeah, once again, that is not inside of the document. We need to execute this line of code after we insert that. So yeah, that's an issue. We can't find an element if it doesn't exist within the document yet. So that's an important distinction there. So let's go back, let's refresh, and now we can see that our current topic is a different color because we replaced the warning class with the success class. So when you need to manipulate the style of an element, typically the best thing that you can do is modify the classes applied to that element using the class list property. You can add, you can remove, you can replace, and you can toggle classes. One of the coolest things that we can do with the DOM in JavaScript is work with attributes. I know that that doesn't sound very exciting, but I guarantee you it is one of the most awesome things that you can do. Because let's just think about HTML. Let's look at a div element. Okay, so the browser encounters a div element and it knows to render it as just a block level element. There's nothing else there. It's completely boring. It's not until we start adding attributes to that element that things start to get a little bit spicier. We can set classes, or we can set the style, or there's other attributes that we can set that would change the way that the browser is going to render that element. When you start thinking about attributes as a data store that we can use to store settings that would change the way that our page behaves, well, that just opens up the door to a whole new set of possibilities. Like, for example, the data-bs-theme attribute. That's a mouthful to say. I'm just going to say data-bs theme. This data-bs theme is a custom attribute for the Bootstrap library. And by setting it to dark, we have told the browser to use the dark theme for Bootstrap. And of course, that is why we see the dark theme. If we get rid of the value of dark for that attribute, then that changes the behavior in the browser. So I want to take this same idea and I want to modify our list so that we will have an actual OL element here inside of our document, but then we will have our own custom attribute. Now, whenever you start using custom attributes, you want to prepend that with data dash. That signifies that it is a non-standard custom attribute. And usually when you see a attribute that starts with data dash, you want to leave it alone if you did not create it. Now, there are some exceptions to that, like, for example, the BS theme attribute. That is an attribute that has a specific purpose of setting the behavior of the theme, which in this case is dark. We're going to do essentially the same thing for our list. We'll just call this data dash theme, and then we can set that to multi, so that if it is set to multi, then we will have our multicolored list. If it's set to anything other than multi, then it will be slightly different, where all of the topics are one color except for the current topic, which we need to change the current topic. We are now talking about working with attributes. Okay, so let's take this into account. We have this OL element. We need to change our JavaScript just a little bit. Instead of creating that element, we can use query selector here to select that OL element, and everything should work. It does. Okay, so we're good there. So now we want to get the value of this data theme attribute, because our list is going to be rendered differently based upon that value. So let's create a variable to store that attribute value. We'll just call it list theme, and we will use our OL element object because we have a method called get attribute, and its purpose is to get the value of whatever attribute we specify. So in this case, that is going to be the data-theme attribute, and that will give us the value. So if we go to the browser, let's refresh. In the console, we have that list theme variable. We can see, well, if I type it correctly, we can see that it is set to multi. That came directly from our attribute. So we have this value now, so that whenever we create these li elements, let's do this. If the list theme is equal to multi, well, then we want to create our list items so that they have those multicolor classes. Now, one thing that we should do here, because HTML is not case sensitive, we should do list theme to lowercase, just so that we normalize whatever value is there and compare that to multi. So with that in place, we should be able to go to the browser, we should refresh, and we see everything is just fine. However, if we change the value of that attribute to something else, well, then we can see that our list is rather plain. But notice here we get an error, cannot read properties of null, and that is reading the class list. Oh, that is down here where we are attempting to retrieve the element that has the class of text warning. Let's get rid of that because we are going to do this a little bit differently. So with that, let's refresh, and that is great. But let's do this. Let's test to see what happens if we don't have this data theme attribute. So let's get rid of that completely. Let's refresh, and now we have an error. We cannot read properties of null. So what we are getting here is because the get attribute method cannot find an attribute called data-theme, it is returning null. So really what we need to do here is provide a default value so that if get attribute finds the data theme attribute, it will get that value. Otherwise, we will assign an empty string to list theme, and that should make that error go away, and that makes our code work. So we're good there. But let's go back. Let's add that data theme. And really what we might want to do is we might want to make the multicolor theme the default. So let's do that. That makes a little more sense. So that if it is set to multi, or if there is no attribute, it will be multi. Otherwise, it will be whatever we set it to. Doesn't matter what. So in that case, we get the results that we expect. Now, the next thing I want to do is add a custom attribute to each individual li element. And to do that, we will use the set attribute method. To set an attribute, we pass two arguments. The first is whatever name that we want that attribute to have. And then the second is the value we want that attribute to have. So I am adding a custom attribute called data-index, and I'm setting the value to the index of that particular topic. So if we go back and refresh, let's take a look at the elements, and let's expand the OL element. We can see that now we have the data-index attribute, and the values are set according to the index of those topics. So that's good. And now what I want to do is set the current topic based upon the value of the data index attribute that we just created. So I'm going to get rid of this else block. And here's how we are going to do this. The first thing we will do is find the element that has the index of our current topic. So let's just call this current topic element. And we will use query selector to select the li element that has a data-index attribute set to our current topic index. That should give us the correct li element so that we can set the class list to have the text info class and the current topic. Not text info, that was text warning, wasn't it? So let's do that, text warning. So now if we refresh, there it is. We successfully retrieved that element based upon the value of the data index attribute, and then we set the appropriate classes. So let's go back to our list, and let's change this to multi so that we can make sure that it is working there as well. It is. So we're good. That's awesome. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is removing an attribute. And that's very easy to do because we just call a method called remove attribute. And there really isn't a good option except for the, the bootstrap theme attribute on the HTML. So let's do that. Let's remove that. We will do document. We want the document element, and we will remove the attribute called data-bs-theme. That will remove that, and that will give us the blinding white page. Let's see what this looks like if we remove the multi value for our list theme. It should look fine. It does. I would say that we should probably use a different color, but the warning text is going to be fine. Now, so far we have been working with custom attributes, but you can use the attribute methods on any HTML attribute, either custom attributes or standard attributes. Like for example, we can add a title to the h1 element. So let's do that. We will use the h1 element object. Let's call set attribute, and we will set the title attribute to, well, whatever. What is the text there? Manipulating the DOM. So let's use that, but let's also make it a little bit different so that we know we actually set this. So this was set in JavaScript. So whenever we go back to the browser, let's refresh. And whenever we hover over the manipulating the DOM, then we see the title pop up. It says manipulating the DOM. Well, that goes away really quick before I can zoom in. Okay, it's not going to let me. But you can see that pop up. Manipulating the DOM set in JavaScript. So it doesn't matter. Custom attribute, standard attribute. You can set them. You can get them, you can remove them. The most important thing that you can do using the DOM is set up event handlers. Now, an event is, well, it's an event. It's something that happens within the document. Most of the time, it is initiated by the user doing something, such as clicking somewhere or moving the mouse around or selecting some text or maybe even typing it into a form field. But there are other events that occur automatically. Like, for example, whenever the browser has completely loaded the page, not just the HTML and the DOM, but also any supporting assets like images, CSS, and JavaScript, there is an event that occurs called the load event. And we can write code that will execute when the load event occurs. Now, before we go on, let me stress that the topic of events is very complex, and we can spend an entire course talking about events. In this course, we are condensing this into 2 lessons, so this is not going to be in-depth, but you will learn the fundamentals and the key things that you need to know about events. So let's first of all clean things up just a little bit. I want to go ahead and use the dark theme, not my theme. I want to use Bootstrap's dark theme. So we will get rid of the code that is going to remove the dark theme. So that's now, yeah, that looks good. That's a good starting point. So this load event, we can set up a load event handler by using the window object. Now, the window object is not part of the document object model. It is actually part of what's called the browser object model. And that key term browser is very important because this means that it is not standard. It is part of the browser, and the browser object model changes between the differing browsers. They have a lot of similarities, but they also have some differences. But when it comes to setting up the load event, it is all the same. And we can do it in 2 ways. The first is to use a property called onLoad. Now, the event itself is called load. That is important. But this property is called onLoad. And we assign this property a function that is going to execute. So basically, onLoad, execute this function. That is going to be different whenever we set up an event listener here in a few moments. But if we write something to the console, we will see some text whenever the browser has loaded our page. And there we go. So what we could do is we could take all of this code for generating this list, and we can place it inside of this function that we use for the onLoad property. And whenever we refresh, we are going to see the same results that we have gotten before because it's the same code it executes, but it executes at a slightly different time when the load event occurs. But the really cool thing about this is that now we can move our JavaScript anywhere because it will execute when the browser has loaded the page. So if you'll remember a few lessons ago, we actually ran into an error when we tried to work with an element that was currently not loaded in the DOM. Well, now that's not an issue because our code will execute after everything has loaded within the page. So I moved the script into the head, refresh, and we still get the same result. So I still think that it's a good idea to put your code at the end of the body, but by using the load event, you can get away from doing that. Now, there is an issue by using the onLoad property, and that is because it can only hold one value at a time. So here I am assigning another value to onLoad. It's another function, And so whenever we go to the browser, we are going to see that the list is not created, but we end up with this message that's written to the console. Well, that's because we assigned a new function to the onload property. And so now that is what is going to execute as opposed to what we wrote previously. So this can be an issue, but we can get around that by setting up what's called an event listener. We have a method called add event listener to where we supply the name of the event that we want to listen for. The name is load in our case. It is not onload. Onload was the property. The name of the event is load. And then we simply specify the function that we want to execute. So we can take this function that we have and we could use that as the code that will execute when the load event occurs. So let's fix our onload here. And now whenever we go back to the browser, we see that our list is there and we can add another event listener for the load event. And this one will just add that message back to the console. And whenever we run this in the browser, we will see both things occurring. We will have our list, but we will also have our message in the console. Now I want to add a button so that whenever we click it, it will toggle the dark theme on the page. Kind of like how it originally was, but now we get to write that. And I'm going to leave the list code in its own script element in the head. I'm going to collapse that just to save a little screen space. This way we can keep our code separated and easier to follow along. So we need a button first of all. And as far as the text is concerned, toggle dark theme. And we need to set up an event listener for the click event on that button. So we first of all need access to that button element object. And it would probably be wise to set an ID. Let's call it page theme toggle button. No, that's too long. A page theme button. I think that's going to be okay. And then we will retrieve this element using get element by ID. And then we will add an event listener for the click event. So here we are back into the DOM and we have that add event listener method. That is because it actually originated as a method in the DOM, and then browser vendors adopted that to set up event listeners for the browser object model. So then we just need our function, and this is going to execute whenever we click on that button. So let's just test it out briefly. It doesn't matter what we write out to the console because we will see it. So let's refresh. We click on the button and we can see that that is occurring. But we are still listening for two load events, aren't we? So let's clear out that other listener just so that we have one. And there we go. All right, so we need to toggle the dark theme. Now that is being set according to this data BS theme attribute in the HTML element. So let's first of all create a variable that is going to store the name of that attribute just so that we don't have to continually type out this entire string because we are human. If we have to type the same string multiple times, there will be a time we get it wrong. So that is data BS theme. And then we want to get the value of that attribute. So we will use the document element property and we will call get attribute. Now we want to normalize this because it could be possible that that attribute doesn't exist. So if it doesn't, we will initialize the attribute value variable as an empty string. And then we just need to compare the attribute value to the string of dark. If it's dark, then we want to remove that attribute. So once again, we will use document element to remove that attribute. Otherwise, we want to set that attribute to the value of dark. And that's all we need to do. So let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh. Whenever we click on toggle dark theme, we see that it works. In this lesson, we are going to change up our plan. Instead of talking about common DOM events, we will discuss the event object and delegation, because these are two very important topics that we should talk about. And yes, common events are important, but that is also information that is readily available. And in the conclusion, we'll talk about some of the places that you can go to get some very good information. So here's what I want to do. We, of course, have the ability to click on a button and toggle the page's theme, but I want to be able to click on the individual LI elements and add a background color to them. So as we are generating our LI elements, we could set up an event listener for each one of those LI elements. So we will listen for the click event, and then we will execute the code that will give it a background color. So the question then is, what background color do we use? Because Bootstrap gives us some complementary colors for our text here. So we can do this. We can set a custom attribute. We'll just call it data color, and we will set that to whatever color that we need for that particular LI element. So if we have text info, then the data color is going to be info. In this other case, it's danger, so we will set that as danger. And I guess since we're here, let's go ahead and let's add an else, and we will go ahead and set up the color for the current topic. I know that we did that programmatically by fetching that element and adding the necessary classes, but we'll get rid of that. That'll also free up some of our code to make things nice and clean, and that will be just fine. So that inside of our click event listener here, the first thing we will do is get the color that we need. So we have that LI object, we will get the attribute, which will give us the value of data color, and then we just need to toggle that class. So we will use our class list to toggle, and the class that we want to toggle starts with bg dash, and then the color name followed by subtle. So it is a subtle background color. So with that in place, we should be able to go to the browser. Let's refresh. And whenever we click on these items, yes, we can see that there is a background color. If we click on them again, we can see that it toggles that background color off. So that's great. I do want to add the pointer as the cursor on those elements, because for the end user, whenever they see the pointer, they know that they can click on something. So we will set the cursor to pointer in the CSS, and that looks good. So this code works, and that is great. However, there is a small little issue, and that is we have essentially set up identical event listeners. They all listen for the click event. They all execute the same code. The only difference is that it executes that code on different elements. And then if you include the click event listener for the button, well, that's 10 click event listeners. And the more event listeners you add to your web page, the more the performance degrades. Now, in our particular case, it's very simple, so we aren't going to see really any performance issue. But as you write larger pages or as you build web applications that have complex user interfaces, that can be a real problem. So instead, what you would want to do is use what's called event delegation. The idea is that we set a click event listener at the topmost level. So in our case, that's the document. And then we check what received the click event. And then if it is a button, we toggle the theme. If it is an LI element, we toggle the background. So then the question is, how do we go about doing that? Well, it's actually quite simple. First of all, we set up an event listener on the document. So let's start there. And since we are handling the click events, we are going to add an event listener for the click event. So then we need to be able to determine what element received the event. And that is given to us through an event object that the browser passes to our function whenever the event occurs. So let's do this. We will write out to the console that event object. And a lot of times you will see that parameter as listed as E. Sometimes it might be event, but there are some issues if you take that approach as well. So you might see event. I encourage you to use E. So let's go to the browser. Let's refresh. And no matter where we click, we are going to see an item in the console because we set the click event listener on the document. So here we can see that we have a pointer event, and we have a pointer event because we used the mouse to click. So if we click, pointer event, you can see that there are a lot of properties here. And one of them is Alt key. We can see that it is false. If I hold down the Alt key and click again, we will see that that is true. So that's useful. The Control key property is also available as well. And we are also going to see several coordinates. In this case, this is the client X and Y. That is the position of the mouse in relation to the viewport whenever we clicked. If we scroll on down, we're going to see layer X and Y. Then we will see offset X and Y. This is a little bit different. So let's clear this out, and I'm going to try to click in the top leftmost corner of the button. So we will click that. Let's scroll down, and we will see that the offset X and Y is -1, which sounds kind of weird, but whenever you consider padding and borders and margins and things like that, you can have a -1 value for a coordinate. So the offset X and Y are the coordinates of the mouse when it was clicked in relation to whatever element received that event. So I clicked on the button, and we can show that by going down to the target property. We can see that the target of this click event was the button that has an ID of page theme button. So whenever I clicked, the offset X and Y coordinates are in relation to the button here. And then if we scroll on down a little bit more, we can see that the type of event was a click event. So there's a ton of information here. A lot of it's very useful. Some of it you will never use, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in our case, we want to use this target because that lets us know what element received the event. So let's start by creating a variable called target, and we will set that to the target from our event object. And so the first thing we will do is check the ID of the target. If it is equal to this page theme button, then we know that we need to toggle the document's theme. So let's just grab all of that code that we already have. Let's paste it inside of that if statement, and we will see that we have the same exact results as we did before. We are able to toggle the page's theme. So now we need to write the code for whenever we click on one of the li elements. So we can add an else if here, and we want to see if the target is an li element that has a data color attribute. And we can do that by using the matches method on our element object. We can pass in a CSS selector, and this is basically going to return true if the element matches that selector, or it'll return false if it doesn't. So our selector is going to be relatively simple. We will check to see if it is an li element that has a data color attribute. If it is, then we can take the code that we wrote up here. Let's cut that out. Let's completely delete the event listener that we defined for each li element. And let's go down to our single click event listener for the document. Now we do need to make some changes here because we are working with the target as opposed to the li element. But once we make that change, our code is going to work. So we can go back to the browser. Let's refresh. Whenever we click on any one of these li elements, we can see that the background is either added or removed. We can toggle the page theme, and everything just works. Now, I know that this can look a little complex, and it certainly looks a little stringed together. So one thing we could do is just break this up into different functions so that we can have a function that is simply toggle dark mode, to where we have the code to, of course, toggle the dark mode. That way, all we have to do inside of our event listener is call this toggle dark mode function. And for the li elements, we could have another function. We could call it toggle background. The only thing here is that we need to know which li element that we need to toggle the background on. So we could just accept the li element as an argument. We, of course, need to make the necessary changes once again. But then inside of our event listener, we can toggle background, pass in the target, and that is much easier to read and maintain. So every time an event occurs, the browser is going to pass an event object to the function that handles that event. That event object has a ton of information that is relevant to the event that occurred. And that is useful whenever you use event delegation, which is setting up a single event listener for a particular event, and then executing the appropriate code based upon whatever element received the event. Manipulating the DOM is key for building rich, expressive user interfaces, and it is my hope that by now you feel much more confident in your ability to manipulate the DOM with JavaScript. As you continue your journey in web development, just remember that learning never stops. It is essential to keep your skills sharp and to stay up to date with the latest trends and best practices. One fantastic resource is the Mozilla Developer Network. Its web docs provide extensive documentation on JavaScript, the DOM, and just about every browser-based technology. It is an invaluable resource that all web developers visit. But also don't forget us here at Tuts Plus. We have hours upon hours of informational content for web developers of all levels, and we are busy cooking up even more content just for you. So if you liked this course and found it useful, hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the Envato Tuts Plus channel. Thank you so much for watching this course. Please feel free to contact me through Twitter, the Tuts Plus forums, or in the comments if you have any questions. From all of us here at Tuts Plus, thank you, and I will see you next time.